This week's podcast is sponsored by MusicCast Bar 400, brought to you by Yamaha. You can experience total immersion in your favourite movies and TV shows with the MusicCast Bar 400, which features DTS Virtual X, enveloping you in virtual 3D surround sound and bringing detail to life all around you. All this room-filling sound comes from a slim, low-profile design that complements your Ultra HD TV. To find out more, visit yamaha.com/true sound. Hello and welcome to the AVForums podcast for Monday the 23rd of September. And joining me in this edition, Steve Withers.
Half a shekel for an old ex-slipper.
Kaz Harlow.
I'm not oppressing you. You haven't got a womb.
And Ed Selley.
Wankers.
Thank you, Ed. Welcome back to the podcast. This is the one with Spears and Munsil. We've pre-recorded the middle bit. Should I tell them that, or should we just look?
No, come on. Let's be completely honest. The meat of the sandwich of this podcast has been carefully pre-prepared, lovingly stored at the correct temperature, and will be there for you to enjoy. We're just going to provide some slapdash bread for either side of it.
Soggy dog-eared bread on either side of it.
Isn't that usual?
Yes.
Anyway,
yeah.
Well, normally the filling is equally rancid.
Normally we skip the filling as well. So this is an unusually appealing plate.
Well, you'll be happy to know that this is for the next 3 weeks. We've got some guests on the podcast. So this week it's Spears and Munsil. We'll get onto that in a bit. We're going to talk about their new disc. We're also going to talk about their history and how they came to be, basically, and what it is that they actually do. Next week, all going to plan, we will have the man from B&W on the podcast, and actually on the whole podcast.
There used to be adverts about the man from CNA. So this will be the
it's a man from Del Monte.
The man from Del Monte.
I'm sorry, I'm old enough to remember long before the man from Del Monte, there was a man at CNA.
Which is the man from Bowers and Wilkins? We have to remember to call it Bowers and Wilkins.
And Andy Kerr.
That's good.
Andy will be joining us.
They get cross if you call it B&W.
They prefer Bowers and Wilkins these days.
But nobody calls it Bowers and Wilkins.
We can discuss this next week and find out exactly what it is that they're like. But yes, all going to plan. Andy Kerr should be on the podcast next week, and he's coming for the entire podcast, or certainly the first half of the podcast. So that should be.
Is he drinking?
You warned him.
I haven't warned him, and I don't know if he's going to be drinking. So we'll see what happens. And then the following week, NanoSys. So we should have nanosystems. So quantum dots, basically. Everything you want to know about quantum dots, the future of OLED with quantum dots, self-emissive quantum dots. We're going to be talking quantum dots. So that's 3 weeks' time. I think we're recording that for the 7th of October podcast. So there you go. We've got some guests coming up. So it's not just us all talking rubbish and nonsense and drunkenness. What have you been up to, Ed?
I've been down at my parents' this weekend. I mean, I don't know if it was the same for everyone, but yesterday really did feel like the last day of summer, by which I mean Saturday.
Yesterday was the last day of summer.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was at Mottisfont, one of the National Trust properties, one of my very favourite places on earth. It was just stunningly beautiful. Today, it's been raining a lot. There was a car show in Andover, which was interesting. Do you remember the Vauxhall Calibra?
Oh yes, I lusted after that car when I was younger.
There were 4 or 5 of them in one place, and I mean, one well-placed hand grenade would have put a significant dent in the surviving number of Vauxhall Calibras anyway. And props to people for bringing some interesting stuff. There were some Mustangs and things like that. I didn't take many photos. I actually didn't take any photos because it was incredibly wet and I was holding an umbrella. But that was pleasant enough. I've seen my parents. I've been doing some work. Obviously, we're not going to discuss this week because we've got proper hardware stuff, but obviously Amazon surprised everybody by launching a high-res music service without telling anybody that they were going to do that. So I've spent quite a lot of time tinkering with that as well. So really.
Is this free for Prime users? Is it?
It's not free for Prime users. They want £13 a month if you're a Prime user.
They can take that £13 and they can stuff it right up their arse.
Well, does even allowing for that rapturous reception from you two, it does make it the cheapest of the high-resolution services. And I have to be honest, the fact that a hyper-global megacorp, which may or may not have some twinges of evil to it, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. The fact that they've got they have an interest in delivering audio quality. I mean, we have to be honest. There have been times over the last 15 years I have been somewhat concerned that we are circling the drain of extinction. Things like this do serve to sort of give me some level of hope that we aren't completely doomed as an industry. So, it's been quite a good couple of days in that regard. So that's me.
Yeah, I've had a really productive week, and I've really enjoyed the last few days because I've had some new toys to play with, and one toy I've been looking forward to playing with for some time, and that's the Sony BVM X300. I thought it was the 310 that was coming. It's not. It's the 300, which is the OLED, which makes sense. If you're going to put it up against, a manufacturer's OLED that claims to get very close to a master monitor, then you want the OLED one. So, it's here, and I have to say, it's absolutely blown me away. You get your money's worth with
35 grand's worth of 32-inch telly.
It's actually 28 grand, but once you add the VAT on. Obviously, if you're a business, you don't need to do that. But,
don't have to. Right.
But yeah, for us mere mortals, we have to add the VAT on. So yeah, it takes up to 35 grand. No speakers. It has 3 fans.
No tuner.
No tuner. It's got 3 fans on the back that are so loud that you've got to turn the audio up on the other TV just to drown it out. Obviously, they're there because it's able to kick out 1,000 nits. And you can tell. And the other thing is, it's 30-inch.
No tone mapping, is there?
No.
Incredibly accurate.
It's incredibly accurate. And the other thing is, 30 inches, pixel density is really good as well. So it looks really, really sharp. And I did put it up against the Panasonic. I shoved the Panasonic into custom mode, warm 3 for color temperature, switched everything else off, and it's absolutely very, very close. I mean, really close. You've got to go into warm 3 because obviously the white point's slightly different on the Sony. It's what's called a...
What are they using on the Sony then?
That's why it's slightly different. That's why it didn't quite look right in warm 2, but when you go to warm 3, it actually looks the way it should be, which is a...
But you'd normally use warm 2 for non...
You would, but this obviously has a very slight tinge of green in its white point, and that's what it's dialed in to be. For certain reasons, it's like I was explaining last week, the Technicolor mode, it has a slight cyan look to it as well, which is what they want in a master system, because that's what they're looking mainly at projection first of all, and then they're looking at display. So that's why these things are slightly different. It's why they have umpteen presets as well. So yeah, you can dial in any white point you want on it. You can set it up anyway. So I've been having a fantastic time. I've actually cut up with loads of TV as well, because I've been sitting watching it in awe with the Panasonic GZ2000 next to it. So I've had a great week. I'm caught up with Discovery now.
It's disappointing, isn't it?
Wasn't what I was expecting.
I would much rather watch a TV series about the Star Trek, about the Enterprise,
which is what I thought they set up. I thought right at the end, I want to see that series.
Monkeys about Discovery and its crew. Glad to see the back of them. Let's go back to Captain Pike, because that was way more interesting.
I've got to say, Captain Pike was brilliant. He was good. The whole thing, and, really good.
That stuff was excellent. So please give me more of that and forget about the Discovery nonsense.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So that's what I've been doing, Steve.
Oh well, for a bit of work, bit of cinema. I've seen 3 movies this week, so a lot of cinema actually. A bit of Spears and Munsil, and a lot of rugby since Friday. That's about me. That's me basically.
Okay, and
nothing particularly exciting.
And we're both heading off to Germany this week, because we're off to look at 8K TVs. So
we are 88-inch 8K. Proper 8K, apparently, if you want to believe the hype. 88-inch 8K OLED, LG, obviously. So big that they couldn't even leave Germany. So we're going to fly to Nuremberg. I think rallies are optional, but we're going to be...
we're trialing a TV.
Yes. Nuremberg, not easy to get to, as it turns out.
No, it's an absolute nightmare. The travelling's going to be a nightmare getting there. But anyway, looking forward to that. Right, so who have we got left? Cars. I know what you've been doing, Kaz. You've been doing loads of reviews and obviously helping, because obviously we've swapped over the forum software this week. I don't know if people noticed that or not. The site was only down for 2 days.
I'm not entirely sure it's fixed now, is it?
It's very nearly there. I would say it's about 97% there now. So little bits and pieces to do on the editorial and so on. But you've had a busy week, Kaz.
Yeah, I mean, between the site going down and we had a couple of servers go down, so I had to whitelist them remotely, which was interesting. And yes, I had about 500 hours of telly to watch in 48 hours. and whilst nursing a cold that my son decided to bring home from school for me. It's been an interesting week. But yes, I'm glad the site is back. That was a challenge.
Yeah, and I've got to say, using the forums side of things and so on, really slick, really quite nice. I'm not bigging it up because I work for the site. It's actually surprised me how good the Zen 402 is, actually.
Yes, it's turned out quite smooth. I think it was just teething problems to begin with. So it's all nice in the end. And yeah, ploughed through a whole bunch of reviews. Everyone decided to release everything all at the same time.
Have you actually slept in the last week?
Not really, but when you got a cold, that thing when you lie down and you just feel like you can't breathe. I found it was conducive towards just staying up watching
sitting and watching television.
and then what happens is that you get up after about 4 hours and you're back to feeling all congested.
You got deep vein thrombosis.
Telly again. So,
you lost the use of your legs.
Yeah, who needs legs?
And you're going to end up like one of those characters, in WALL-E, when they get to the spaceship and all the humans are just sat in those hovering things watching TV. That's what you're going to turn into, Kaz, if you're not careful.
All right.
You're going to become one with the sofa.
I know, but the needs must. I think I was on the back burner this week.
I don't think some of the stuff you review really needs to be reviewed.
No, I've tried to tell him this, Steve, but
we cover a lot less Blu-rays now.
Is that because there are less Blu-rays to cover?
No, there are like 10 a week that are
Yeah,
released.
but what you've done is you've stopped reviewing Blu-rays and now you're reviewing even more TV.
Every single thing Netflix makes, apparently. Even the stuff is going to be rubbish before you even put it on.
But that's different. I mean, we cover all the 4K, even if it's not good, don't we? We don't turn up and go, hey, Transformers is really bad, so we're just not going to cover the 4K disc. And
Kaz, can you review the one on Kaz, can you review the thing on Netflix where the man solves crimes by smell? I can't remember what it's called, but someone I follow on Twitter is become quite obsessed with it. It's not in English. But a man solves crimes with his nose.
Go and put a comment on my profile, because that's what people are going to start doing. Because this is what's happening. Someone commented on my profile. When are you going to review City on a Hill? And when my eyes have stopped bleeding,
10 hours to watch it.
Then it's really good. It was really good. But clearly people are just starting to recommend stuff.
There's too much.
If I didn't have enough, so yeah. I mean,
it's called The Sniffer.
I'm not reviewing The Sniffer. I have to draw lines.
That's a dangerous Google search.
Yeah.
There are no less than 3 seasons of it for you to enjoy as well. I've stuck it into the comment section.
Is it?
Pass. I'm not doing it.
Well, if you feel that Kaz is being unfair towards this fascinating program, do let us know in the comments. It's Russian. What could possibly go wrong?
Come on. Yeah.
I think we're going to get a stage soon, if we haven't already surpassed it, where reality is just a very strange thing for Kaz. He watches so much TV and so much stories and fantasy and all the rest of it. You'll be struggling as to what's actually real now.
Yeah, I'm way ahead of that. I mean, someone had to remind me that Endgame was fantasy. So,
yeah, I don't. Well, but no, as I say, I'm just fast. I too will give it a whirl at some point, because the premise just strikes me as fascinatingly awful.
You can review it. I'll happily proof your review.
Well, again, if you feel that I should suddenly have a go at reviewing television programs, yeah, all right. Make yourself known in the comments. We'll see how we go.
Not that there isn't already too much to watch, because American Horror Story started again, and I'm quite enjoying that.
Well, it has, but you know what? It was one episode, and it's interesting you should say that. I'm glad you were quite enjoying it. I was not in the least.
Well, of course I was enjoying it. It's 1984. It's the kind of videos I was watching back then. So
I know, but it needs more than that. It was just one episode, nothing.
Well, yeah, give it a chance. It wasn't in the first episode.
You're right.
It laid the groundwork well.
I couldn't turn in a review based on that.
No, you could not on one episode. But the Deuce hasn't started yet, has it?
No, I don't know where that's gone. But thank the Lord.
I think it'll be next week, because this week's the last episode of Euphoria. So next week, the Deuce will start.
If they can delay some streaming for a little bit, that'd be.
No, I'm not going to do that.
Right, okay, let's move on. Current competitions. What have we got for winning, Ed?
Oh, hang on. I'm nowhere near
there's
the
one
itinerary.
to add to this.
Oh, steady. Okay.
Steady on.
Right. Well, shall I start, and then
you
you can add your extras. Right. You can win a copy of Woman at War on Blu-ray. That's open until the 30th of September. You can win a copy of Jackie Chan's Police Story and Police Story 2 on Blu-ray, which is open until the 1st of October. Win a copy of We the Animals on Blu-ray, also 1st of October. Win a copy of. We've already got the copy of Woman at War, although apparently that one goes for an extra day. There may be some overlap on that. I'm just reading. I'm doing a Ron Burgundy here and reading what's on the thing. Win a copy of Kursk, The Last Mission on Blu-ray, 2nd of October. Win copies of Criterion September titles on Blu-ray, 7th of October. Win a copy of Arrow, the complete 7th season on Blu-ray. That's open to the 8th of October. And win a Yamaha Music Cast Bar 400 worth £429. And you've got till the end of October on that one. These competitions are open to anyone except Phil, basically.
Yeah. You got
right, what are you adding, Cass?
Brexit Day for the album.
Yeah, the added one is we got Rocket Man on 4K.
Ooh.
So that has
But I think
just
it's going
gone
to be a
live.
long time.
And that's open till the October the 15th.
Excellent. Well, that's good. Sorry, I've just been reminded of something I got sent yesterday. I'm going
Multitasking.
Yeah, I'm good at that. Hang on.
You're not.
No, I'm not. But
Can we have the previous competition winners before you...
well, I've done it now anyway. Right. Previous competition winners: Rob T.I. wins a copy of The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith on Blu-ray, and T. Murphy wins a copy of Castle Rock on Blu-ray. So heartiest congratulations to you both.
Yeah, and there's quite a few sitting in there as well to go through the system. So
many wonderful winners.
Yeah, so we should have more winners next week. Right, so at this point we're going to be dead slick and pretend that the middle section isn't pre-recording. We'll be back in a sec with hardware. And moving on to the hardware news section of the podcast, and we're doing things slightly different this week. We have two special guests with us. We have hinted at this in the past that we were going to get Stacey and Don onto the podcast because they've got an exciting new product that we want to talk about. It's a new disc release from them. There have been lots of questions on the forums as well. Steve did a review of the disc about 6 weeks ago. Steve, is that correct?
I think review's generous. I scraped the surface. Yeah, it was back in August 26th it went up, actually.
Right, okay. Yes, it's a fantastic disc. We're going to go into it in some detail. But first of all, Stacey and Don, tell us a little bit about yourselves, because obviously people related to AV in some way or another will have heard, Spears and Munsil named together. You have released a couple of discs in the past. You've also been pretty prominent in the industry for some time now, more in the States than over here in the UK, but certainly with the advent of the internet, everything's now a world stage. So your name will be well known, but perhaps people don't know you as individuals. So Stacey, maybe you'd like to go first and then we'll go on to Don.
Sure. So my name is Stacey Spears, and I started reviewing AV products somewhere between 95 and 97 on a website called Seekers of Home Theater and High Fidelity. So early days of the internet, at least for review magazines. And I think it was around 1999, I worked on a series called The DVD Benchmark. And that's actually led to the introduction of Don and myself, because Don had read it and he had contacted me when he found out we both worked at the same company. And we basically started doing, I think I actually got him to join the team I was on, a multimedia team at Microsoft, working on Media Foundation at the time and Direct Show. And it sort of started from there. I think one day I was like, can we build a better color bars test pattern? And that was the very first pattern our pattern generator had generated.
So for you, what was the draw? Was it the technical side, the looking at an image and wanting to evaluate exactly what was going on within a display? What was your speciality?
Well, so if I go back even further, I think it was in the Army. I was stationed in Georgia, and it was incredibly hot, so I'd go to the movies all the time because that was the only place there was air conditioning. Because your barracks, you wouldn't actually get AC unless it was over 90 degrees 3 days in a row. So what would happen is it would be 90, 90, 89, so they would not turn on the AC. So I spent a lot of time at the movies. So once I got out and started school, a classmate had convinced me to get a Laserdisc player, because I had been using, I think I got an SVHS deck, but there were no SVHS movies. So he convinced me to get a Laserdisc player, and then he told me about this disc called a Video Standard, which was Joe Kane's first Laserdisc. And so I had bought that, And then I think around 95, I took my first ISF class. And so that's sort of everything sort of started on my obsession with video quality.
And how did you get into the reviewing side of things?
Well, again, I think I had a classmate who was a fantastic writer, and he just couldn't afford to buy any AV gear at the time. So I tried to get him to do writing, and he wasn't interested in that. And somehow I ended up doing it. And I don't really remember how I'd even contacted Secrets at the time. It's been so long.
and you did specialize for some time with DVD players when they were first introduced, didn't you? Because I remember reading quite a few of your articles online at that time.
Yeah, and that was back in 99 when the DVD benchmark first started. And so if you want to know how that actually began, so Meridian had sent me their $20,000 DVD player. And I think I told this story recently to Don, and I had decided that I didn't want to do like a typical review where you put in the fifth element and you talk about how a veil had been lifted. And so what I wanted to do, I'd actually reached out to Joe Kane, and he pointed me to some articles he had done in the Perfect Vision where he'd reviewed Laserdisc players using waveform monitors. And so I knew I wanted to use the Tektronix VM700 because it was this automated system that could produce signal-to-noise ratio, just all kinds of actual numbers instead of just looking at a scope. But it was, I think, $2,000 to rent. And I didn't really have the money at the time to rent, so I convinced JJ to rent one if I got a bunch of DVD players together. So I figured, okay, we'll run a bunch of DVD players through it, and if we're going to do video, we should do audio, so I was able to borrow an Audio Precision from work. And then I had a coworker who his job was usability study, so I got him to basically do a usability study on the remote control, because I thought it'd be kind of cool to cover remotes. And that's how the DVD benchmark really began.
Don, do you want to come in at this point?
Sure. Well, Stacy told you how we met. We both worked at Microsoft, and we were both engineers. We are both engineers. And, I have been interested in video and home theater. I've been a film buff most of my life, have always had the highest end video I could afford. I was always the first to buy a 16:9 TV back when that was a thing. I was calibrating. I had copies of the video standard Laserdisc player. And so I contacted Stacy because I realized that some comment he'd made on a Secrets of Home Theater article made me realize, he must be at Microsoft. So I looked him up in the company directory and emailed him. And we both have similar attitudes about precision and about doing things the right way. We've always been fascinated by all the ins and outs, the insides of video. How does video really work? What's the history of video and so forth? And I guess we have enough ego to think that we can make better patterns. We can find a better way to do things. My background is a little more on color theory, and I have more experience with actual writing code. So our experience, complements each other pretty well. I write most of the code for Spears and Munsil and do most of the color theory thinking and so forth. But, the two of us collaborate on, making the patterns, designing the patterns. Stacy is perhaps a little more of the visionary. He has this vision of the disc that we want, and I'm the more hard-nosed guy who has to say, is there actually a way that can be done? Because I'm not 100% sure of that. But, often if we put our heads together, we figure out we've had patterns we've been batting around for years and years and years, things we'd like to do to test something or to do something that we haven't been able to do because there just isn't any way to do it, especially when it comes to things like, we've been wanting to have a pattern that would really let you see the differences in gamma clearly and easily without having to use test equipment. And that's kind of a problem. How do you show gamma? Anyway, I'm kind of rambling.
No, it's fascinating stuff. So, obviously, you both got long histories with this. You met up at Microsoft and moved on. And in that time, because you're talking 99 onwards, aren't you, really, from there? So, displays have changed an awful lot since then, and we're at a stage now where we're even talking about moving to 8K, which seems ridiculous, but that's where we are at this moment in time. So from 99 to where we are now, you have had 3 disc releases. So maybe go back to the first one. What was the driver behind it? Why did you want to release it? And what made you think there was a need for it at that time?
Well, so Before we had done our first disc or even thought about doing it, I tried to get Joe Kane and Guy Kuo, who was the author of Avia, together, because Guy had the technical background on patterns, and Joe, of course, had the industry contacts and new industry standards. I tried to get them together to build a disc, but that never happened. And then one day, Oppo reached out and said, hey, we're working on a Blu-ray player. It'd be great if you could do a disc. And Oppo had said that, doesn't matter. Don't worry about making our player look good. If you break us, we'll fix it. So, which was a really nice way to come from, because we had another manufacturer around the same time said, hey, we want you to make us a disc, but we want you to make us look good and everyone else look bad, which is actually much harder than it sounds.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound like manufacturers at all.
No.
So it was, it was nice with Oppo's attitude, where there was, go ahead and make us look bad because we'll fix it. In fact, during the development of the first disc and before their player actually shipped, the BDP-83, I think it was, we had found a problem with their decoder, and I didn't think there was any way to fix it. And sure enough, they got it fixed before it shipped. So that was nice to see.
Yeah.
So anyways,
I'm sorry, Stacey, but I remember one of the first interactions with Oppo was that their head engineer read the Progressive Scan shootout that we both worked on and basically handed that off to his team and said, I want passing check marks in every column on this chart. I want the next disc to meet all of these requirements. And he contacted us and said, we're trying to make the very best Progressive Scan DVD player possible. So this was even before the disc. They really appreciated what we were doing, taking a more technical and scientific approach to analysis and evaluation.
Yeah, we could definitely tell you that when the first article came out on the chroma bug, we had some manufacturers that were very unhappy with us. Well, and I should step back. First, before we even published the article, I think we went to player manufacturers, didn't really get a lot of traction, so we went to decoder vendors like C-Cube and National Semiconductor at the time. And that didn't get much traction there. In fact, one of them was like, well, our chip does it right. The player manufacturer did it wrong, but they didn't seem that interested in correcting them. In fact, we even got a meeting with the head of MPEG. Was that Dr. Leonardo Chirigliano, I think?
Yeah.
And again, he's like, well, that's not really MPEG's part to do the up and down sampling. That's that's separate. It's not part of MPEG.
His point was that MPEG's spec said how to do it. It wasn't really MPEG. MPEG didn't really have a lot of leverage in this. The spec is correct. The fact that lots of decoder vendors weren't following the spec, were taking essentially shortcuts, not really his problem. And we were hoping that somehow he could pass along that MPEG, reminder that this was the spec and you should do it this way. And his attitude was, we make the spec and then the chip manufacturers and the implementers do their thing. We don't really have any way to make them do it.
Which was disappointing. And so then we decided to write an article. And in the article, of course, we figured we'd get the consumers to complain. And there were two different DVD player manufacturers I met up with. One was pretty livid with me when I saw him at CES. And he said that basically he was getting called from customers who wanted a refund because their player had this problem, which was our point. I mean, we tried to give them the opportunity a year earlier to make a change, but they wouldn't. So we thought we'd use the consumers. And that's where that
I remember that article. I remember the furore surrounding it. And I remember everyone used to pause the scene where the guy was about to press the big red button in Fifth Element as being a scene to show the chroma bug.
Right. Yeah, that was a funny thing with the chroma bug. I remember when Stacey first showed it to me. It's one of those things where once you see it, you can't not see it. And on the players where it was bad, it was all over the place. But I think if you go back to that time, everybody was so excited to have something so pristine compared to, say, Laserdisc or, God forbid, VHS. I mean, DVD looked so good. So we were so excited about all these beautiful, pristine pixels that, I think little problems that mostly were visible in, bright red patches, it didn't register. It wasn't that people didn't mind so much. They knew it was there, but everything else looked so good that they just didn't mind. It's almost like it was invisible. Like we hadn't adjusted to this new resolution. And it's funny because I remember when DVD came out, I just thought, oh my God, this is amazing. This is astonishing. And now you pop in a DVD and you're like, wow, this is, this isn't so good. Already Blu-ray is starting to look a little bit shaky. And my son we sit down to watch a film and he's like, is this 4K? Wait a minute. Are we watching Blu-ray? What are you foisting on me? I'm like, oh, kid, you don't understand.
You don't know you're born.
Yeah, I kind of want to show him like a VHS tape. I don't think he's ever seen a VHS. I think he would look at this and say, "You used to watch this? What?"
It's not even the resolution of VHS. They used to use filthy prints. There was no effort made. It was pan and scan. I mean, it was just dreadful. We've come so far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and as much as the manufacturers got mad at us, consumers that had these players with bugs, I think, got even more upset at us. And they got very defensive on the players they
pointing
purchased.
it out.
Exactly. Well, we had someone local that I think Don went to his house because he's like insisting he could not see the bug. And so when Don got to his house, this I think person had a rear projection CRT TV, and I believe what the left lower quadrant was completely out of convergence.
Yeah.
And the customer didn't even see that. So, so I think Don ruined his day.
Yeah. No, he emailed me, a little while later saying, "Yeah, I got a new DVD player and I'm having a calibrator come out and fix the convergence." Because it's funny. I mean, it's amazing how blind we can be to visual artifacts. It's like our brain just kind of fills in the details we want to be there. And then if you say, okay, look at this, you see how there's this color fringe on the side of this and then a different color fringe on the other side? Yeah, that's not in the movie. That's your TV. Or, in the case of Chroma Bug, you point to a particular patch and say, see these little jagged edges on the side? Those aren't supposed to be there. It's supposed to be smooth. And now once you see that, once you know what you're looking for, suddenly you see it all the time and it just ruins your enjoyment in a sense. Maybe it deepens your enjoyment. I don't know. Once you get it fixed, you're like, ah.
One of the things I find amusing and also worrying at the same time on our forums is that as soon as people get new TVs, they're straight on with the slides. Slides and test patterns and so on, which is great, but at the same time, they're wanting to find something wrong with the display, or they're looking for something that's wrong with the display. And a lot of the time, because they're looking at patterns, and I think it's important to bring this point up, and not looking at actual content as well, sometimes they get a little bit too anal when it comes to, well, this is not 100% right, but actually they wouldn't notice it with normal content. So it is, is it a problem that people just take it too far? Because from what I see with the forums, some people do, and they'll change the TV 8 or 9 times because they think they see something within a pattern or a slide.
Well, to that point, when I worked at SpectraCal on Calman, every time we would do a release, customers would regenerate 3D LUTs, even though none of that changed at all. Yet they would want to create a 3D LUT every time there was a new release when they didn't really need to.
Yeah.
I think what's important is a sense of perspective. I mean, in engineering, if you're actually designing, building, evaluating, if you're professionally working with video, it's important to be precise. That's kind of an article of faith, I think, among engineers, is that this stuff matters. This stuff makes a difference. People can see these minor things. Maybe not all the time, maybe not on every content, but any artifact that could distract you from enjoying the content is potentially a bad artifact. Now, on the flip side, are you ever going to get a system that is perfect? Unlikely. But, the secret is to sort of, when you're in evaluation mode and you're just trying to find out how does all this work together, how is this working, what artifacts are there, to be precise, to be anal, if you will. And then try to let that stuff go and just say, this is, I've got a good system that works well. I think perhaps certain personality types find that easier than others. Some people, once they know that there's an artifact in their system, they can't rest until they've fixed it. I suppose it's like the car owner who sees a little tiny fleck in the paint that isn't quite right. And, some people say, tiny fleck, no biggie. Others will take it down to the body shop and have them buff it out and then repaint. And, So, don't be obsessive if when it's not appropriate, I guess, is especially try to enjoy the content. I mean, that's what we're all here for. Yeah. There have been many times when I have owned equipment that for watching TV that I knew had significant flaws, but it worked for what I was doing at the time. And Stacy, I'm sure, feels the same way. He's had various components that he knew had a particular issue. And it's a balance, that particular issue was not as bothersome as the issues with other devices. Or in some cases, it's like you can't afford to be changing everything out all the time. I think if people are changing everything out all the time, well, God bless them. They've got plenty of money and, they're helping to support the world economy or whatever. Yeah. So
I was going to say that, for a long time I had this 20-inch CRT interlaced in my kitchen, and I would get more enjoyment watching content on it because I knew it was interlaced. I didn't care. I was sitting 10 feet away. So I just enjoyed the show, whereas in my theater, I'm a lot more picky.
Yeah.
And
You found these issues. Manufacturers weren't too happy to start with. But where did the story go from there?
Well, so I think at the time we were pretty cruel to the Panasonic RP91, which had a Genesis deinterlacer in it. And the head of that team contacted us, and he was very happy that we actually did these type of tests. And he was even more happy because he had another player, the RP56, which is the first to include the Faruja chip in it. But he wasn't allowed to tell anybody because, it's their product, it's their technology. They don't acknowledge anybody else's inside. So when we publicly announced that, he was incredibly happy because, the player did really well. And it was, I think, only $200 at the time. Might have been $199.
If I can go, I think about having worked at Microsoft and thinking about a lot of engineers at these companies, they care about this quality, but they are sometimes at the mercy of, marketing people and other money people who say, does this quality really matter? And the engineers often really, really like the kinds of stuff that we do because it helps them sell the idea that the quality matters, that it's worth paying $1.50 extra to get the fancier deinterlacer instead of the cheapest deinterlacer, because the marketing people just hear blah, 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 deinterlacer, whatever. Or, similarly in a TV, they might use a 10-bit versus a 12-bit processing chain for some particular video processing chip. And the engineers say, well, we'd rather have the 12-bit chip, but it'll cost 75 cents more. And the cost reducers are like, 75 cents? My God, do you think we're made of money? And so articles like the stuff we write are something that people can point to. They can slap this down and say, look, if we use the cheaper one, we're going to fail this test. Or, the reviewers are going to be all over us because they're going to be able to measure it. So discs that can show artifacts and articles that talk about the deep artifacts help motivate influencers and reviewers to look at those artifacts and to talk about them. And that helps drive improvements. It's a slow process. It's a multi-year process, as we can tell you. But, this matters. And typically the engineers at these companies are on our side. It's the marketing people that aren't.
To give you another example, recently, I don't know if you're familiar with Don Eklund. He's with Sony Pictures. He's been very supportive of our latest disc. In fact, he'd set up a meeting with us to do a demo with the UHDA. And then we did another one for the ASC MyTech group. Actually, we did 2 that day. So, he's been a big supporter of promoting it.
We've certainly found that over the years. I mean, obviously we come from a completely different side of things where we're reviewing, but even so, for a long time at AVForums, we pushed for calibration controls on TVs because if you go back to 99 or we started reviewing 2006, there was nothing on a TV. It was only specialist manufacturers that would maybe put some white balance controls in a hidden menu somewhere, or if you were very lucky, you got a CMS system on a TV, but it was very rare back then. And one of the things that I found, certainly talking to the companies and doing presentations and consulting and pushing forward what we would like to see, was that the engineers were always there first, and a lot of them are still people who, if I go to a certain, show or whatever, they're straight up and we're talking and we're talking about how we improve the product. And I've always found that, certainly from Japanese manufacturers and Korean manufacturers, that certainly their engineering teams, they're always looking for what's the consumer looking for? How do we make this better? So it's interesting that you were getting that all the way back then, because it's certainly a theme. I know Steve will back me up on this. It's certainly a theme that we still get today, where talking to the engineering teams, it's like great. It's then fighting that cause and trying to push it through to the marketing teams to actually put it on the product.
That's true.
Yeah. Well, historically, I don't think companies liked press speaking with engineers directly. They've always wanted to shield that because engineers will just tell you the truth or give you the actual answer, and marketing doesn't appreciate that sometimes. So it's nice to see that at some of these shows or even some of these private launch events where they'll actually bring their engineers with them.
Yeah, that's a big turnaround from where it was, just 10 years ago. Yeah, that wouldn't have happened. Whereas now you go to a CES event and, everybody's laid out there for you to talk to and to ask questions and so on. So certainly from that point of view, and it sounds like you've had the same reception, a hard start, but then building relationships and moving things forward.
Yeah, and it's funny because you had mentioned, the very few controls we had, and they were in secret menus. I had honestly forgotten until this moment that we used to have to use service menus. Yeah. Because now, like you said, they've moved stuff out of and manufacturers do not like you in service menus.
No, absolutely not.
Because it's dangerous.
So was the genesis of the first Blu-ray, the first benchmark disc, Oppo? Were they sort of instigators of that idea?
They did. I mean, I think, like I said, I had tried to get Joe and Guy to do it, but then when Oppo came to us and wanted to do it, and in fact, we weren't even planning to sell the first disc as it was because it was so small in scope. Like we didn't have window patterns to do white balance calibration, and that was because we were going to bundle it with the Oppo player, and so we wanted everything you could do through the UI without test instruments. And then, of course, right before the disc shipped, Oppo was like, "Well, if you want to sell it too, that would be great." We're like, "Okay." So we hadn't even considered it at the time.
We'd done some patterns before that, right? I mean,
maybe
I'm getting the timing wrong. We built some patterns on contract for people, and we built some patterns for our own use, certainly.
Yeah, we had made, I think, a DVD at that time for DVDO or Anchor Bay Technologies. And even then, we were making patterns, and somehow I got conned into actually authoring the disc as well. So that's my first and last disc authoring I've done myself, because that's a lot of work. And then
I remember when it came out, it was a godsend for me because previous to that, the main disc you could buy was DVE.
Yeah.
So I had the DVD, the HD DVD, and the Blu-ray of DVE, and that was a pig to navigate. Whereas your disc was an absolute pleasure to navigate, and it explained everything, and it was just it was a completely different experience from what had gone before. I feel really bad about moaning about that on the third edition, because once you explain what goes on behind the scenes, I realized how incredibly complicated it actually was.
Well, we actually made a really bad assumption with this latest one. And again, I'll step back for a second. When we first started on this, we'd actually planned to do 2 discs. The first was going to be, again, a small in scope disc just for the press, which would be no instructions, because a lot of the patterns were what you've had before, just in HDR. So we assumed that people would remember how to use them. Bad assumption. And then a year later, we were going to do a full disc with Dolby Vision on everything. The problem is that and we ended up shipping that first disc a year and a half late, and it sort of migrated between both discs. So it had a lot more content than originally planned, and no Dolby Vision, and no help. So, but there are technical limitations on the help, as I explained in the forum, and I can explain again. So we're actually, for this add-on we're working on for next year, we're hoping to get help back in either through subtitle text or with pop-up menus, but without graphics because of the graphic limitation I had mentioned. But the big assumption we had made was that people who were familiar with the discs and the patterns before would have no problems with the new one. We were wrong. So after the first Blu-ray, we knew we wanted to do a second. And at some point when 3D was announced, we decided that our second disc definitely needed to be 3D, especially since Don's a big stereo fanatic. The problem is the
fanatic
tools.
Sounds like such a bad word. I don't know. Aficionado.
Enthusiast. Stereo enthusiast. Right. So we knew we wanted to do 3D support, but at the time, even when we did the disc, there wasn't a 3D encoder that was available to us to do what we want. So on the first disc, we did VC1, and because I was actually working on VC1 at the time, I had put features in the encoder I wanted to give me the control on encoding the patterns the way I wanted. And then, of course, the open source X264 for H.264 had that capability as well. It just didn't support 3D. And so what we ended up doing, we looked at modifying X264, but that was a lot of work to add 3D support. So a coworker of mine had a better idea, and that was we would encode every static pattern as 2 frames. The first frame is the left eye, the second frame is the right eye. And then we actually wrote a tool that would split that up into 2 files and do all the necessary touch-up to make it look like a valid MVC stream. So it was a perfectly valid 3D stream that we just encoded as 2D to begin with.
Right.
And then later there was another company, Fixstars I think it was, had come out with a 3D encoder based on X264 called Accelocoder X. And so I purchased that to encode the motion patterns. And shortly after I purchased it, they were purchased by someone else and the product was pulled from the market. So luckily I'd got it at the right time. And then for the montage itself, that was encoded by Deluxe using a Cinemacraft encoder. But and we had another issue there was, so the first disc was authored by Giant Interactive and a friend there named Jay Chumley, who we had met when I was working on VC1 and HDDV and Blu-ray. And so he authored the first disc, and he was going to author the second disc. The problem was his company didn't have the 3D upgrade. So we actually paid for the 3D upgrade for the company, but then that muxing tool couldn't mux our single frame patterns. It would just crash. And that company was like, yeah, we're not really going to fix that. So I'd reached out to Sony, and Sony actually loaned us Blueprint, their authoring software, which did work. The problem was then Jay actually left the business, and so we had to switch to a different authoring company, which ended up being GDMX, who authored all of Warner Brothers titles. And so, yeah, there were a lot of technical difficulties getting the second disc out that we had to overcome. And that was in addition to just making 3D patterns themselves.
That was, by the way, when Stacy says I'm into stereo, we was talking about stereoscopic photography, not hi-fi systems. Yeah. I do like a hi-fi system as well, but, it's a whole different thing. I feel like, we were one of the few companies that ever did a 3D, test disc. And that was interesting because we were breaking new ground. What should be on a 3D test disc? That was a really interesting problem to try to answer, is what do you need to look at? Do you need, and we thought about all the different 3D display systems. People need to converge. People want to make sure that they've got actual 3D across their whole screen, thinking about film pattern retarders and polarized systems and shutter glasses systems and so forth. And I don't know, I feel really proud of that 3D disc. I'm sad that 3D seems to be either dead or on indefinite hiatus for a while, but it'll always come back. If there's one thing about the history of 3D, it goes away, it comes back, a whole new generation says, whoa, 3D, this is amazing. But why hasn't anybody done anything?
I've got to say, though, theatrically, and myself and Steve were talking about this not too long ago, I mean, they have really brought the technology on when it comes to converting into 3D for, big screen presentations, IMAX, that kind of thing. Especially the Avengers movies, they were absolutely stunning in 3D compared to where we were a few years ago.
I was always a die-hard. If it's not shot natively, I won't go and see it. But I have to say that some of the conversions I've seen recently, particularly by Marvel, have been amazing.
Yeah.
I take it all back. I think these days a conversion can look incredible. And it's still cinema is still a valid format. Unfortunately, obviously, the TV manufacturers all decided to junk 3D. And because of that, I mean, certainly in the States, most studios rather don't seem to release 3D discs. It's still, you tend to get a lot more 3D releases in Europe. It's still quite popular in Asia. So it's still quite popular as well. But obviously the problem is unless you've got a projector, there's nothing to watch it on. But that disc you released was another godsend, because obviously there was nothing else you could use at the time for 3D test patterns. Even pattern generators didn't tend to support 3D at the time. So from my perspective, the second edition was as essential as the first.
So I'm like you in that I want to see it shot in 3D, not a conversion. Whereas Don is acceptable either way. But your comment about European discs still releasing in 3D. Well, Don, every time I go to his house, he has new stacks of 3D discs from Europe.
And occasionally Asia. But yes, yeah, it's frustrating. It's very odd to me. But anyway, that's kind of a side question, is like, why is it pencil out economically for Disney to release 3D Blu-rays in, say, the UK when it doesn't make sense for them to release them in the US? I mean, that seems to be like some sort of weird accounting problem. They're mastering.
We don't get the 4K version.
Yeah, quite often they don't release the 4K disc instead. So you win some, you lose some.
Right. So people obviously buy the 4K from the US. Yeah. And the 3D people are buying the 3D from, maybe the studios. This is crazy. But maybe they just release all the discs worldwide.
Bundle it all together in one package. It would make my life a lot easier and cheaper.
Well, they did that with Alita, didn't they?
Yeah, they've done it occasionally. Alita's a good example. Obviously, it's Cameron, so he's got so much pull that he gets whatever he wants. But they did it with Passengers as well. It's been a few, but I end up having to buy, because I really like the Marvel conversions. I think they're really good. So I end up buying the 4K disc from the States and the 3D disc in the UK, so that ends up being quite expensive.
Right. So at least there's no region coding to block you from doing that.
That is true. Yes, that is a godsend with 4K.
I don't think 4K would have gotten anywhere if it had been region coded. I think it would have been on a...
Region coding was kind of a thing of the past anyway, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah. Right. So we've covered your first two discs, and basically every time technology's moved on, you've both looked at what is maybe required and then gone away and come up with a product. So let's move on to the new product, the UHD benchmark disc. Again, what was the genesis for that? Was it just because we had HDR coming along and there was so many different flavors and manufacturers having their own ideas of how things that perhaps we needed a benchmark?
Well, I think before HDR existed, had they just done 4K by itself, we probably would have had a disc a long time ago, because resolution is not a problem. It's when they added HDR, that's when everything changed. Because we're no longer dealing with, because we don't have displays today that meet the full spec of 10,000 nits and our full BT 2020, we have to deal with tone mapping. And so how should test patterns deal with that? Which is kind of why we made the disc very complex and including, having multiple versions of patterns. But
our original concept for the disc was, we'll just extend, it'll just be an easy thing where we'll just take basically the same patterns and extend them into HDR. There might be a handful that might need, a new pattern for HDR. And as the deeper we dove, the more we discovered that was not true, that HDR changes a lot of things. HDR is under the covers is very, very different. It doesn't seem that different when you first look at it, but we ended up having to redo a lot of patterns and rethink a lot of patterns. There are a fair number on there that are really just 4K versions of the same pattern, but it's really surprising when you start taking into account tone mapping and the sort of vagueness about what is correct. With SDR, one thing that you could definitely say is the whole code space was designed to be viewable, right? Like the code space on the disk, and the range from at least from 16 to 254 was intended to be visible. And I know that some people say 16 to 235 in 8-bit encoding, but 16 to 254 was intended to be viewable. And so you could say that's right or that's wrong. With HDR, suddenly in 10-bit, 64 to 940 is the sort of the nominal range. And there's still, the jury is out on whether the range above 940 is even intended to be viewable, because above 940 you're getting above 10,000 nits. As it is, we don't have any displays that can display 10,000 nits. So suddenly we've got this range and there is no clarity on exactly what is correct. It is in some places there is, but in other places it's really just the interpretation of the manufacturer, the interpretation of it's just very loosey-goosey in some ways. And it kind of needs to be, because of all these different technologies that can produce all these different brightnesses. And because of the decision that they would encode disks with absolute nit levels. That took a long time, for me anyway, to wrap my head around after spending so much time thinking about SDR, to think about this absolute nit thing. At first, my first thought was, well, this is wrong. This is just a very bad idea. This shouldn't be. Stacy had already made the transition and kind of understood it, and he brought me along essentially. And as we dove into it, it became clearer and clearer why that people had pushed for this and why it happened. But
I was going to say, that's a story actually I just wanted to tell. I wanted to bring up how you started off not understanding why anybody would want absolute over relative, and then by the end you were sort of more in the absolute camp.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and it's a very subtle, it's a very subtle thing to try to explain to somebody, why is absolute useful? What is the value of using absolute levels? And I think there are still situations people can come up with a scenario in which relative levels would make more sense, but it's a real paradigm shift, for most of the history of imaging. For all of the history of imaging, let's not say most, let's say all, going all the way back to the Daguerres and Fox Talbot, and, imaging has been relative brightness. And the world is relative brightness. If I take a photograph and I look at it inside, I've got relative brightness levels on that photograph based on the reflected light coming from an indoor lamp. Take it outside in the bright sunlight, suddenly the total brightness has gone up by 10 or 100x, 1000x, depending on how dim it is inside and how bright it is outside. It could be, multiple orders of magnitude different brightness. We don't perceive that photo as any different. So it's very obvious to think of imaging in terms of relative brightness. All images should be, relative brightness. And that was what SDR was based on. So to say, no, we're going to assume that it's viewed in an indoor space basically. And we're going to say that we're going to have absolute brightness levels encoded on the disk so that we know what the actual intent is. Seems really odd. It seems very strange. But in fact, it makes a lot of sense. It really allows you to capture the intent on the disk in a way that relative just can't. You can really set a bright scene to be bright, absolutely bright. You want it to be, shown as bright as the device can show it. You can really look at a dim scene and feel confident that it really is going to look approximately the same from device to device, which is something that relative cannot give you. And that's one of the trickiest things, is that and this has been true with theaters as well. Filmmakers have complained about this for years. In movie theaters, you work out this dim scene that looks exactly the way you want it, especially in some kind of dark movie where you've got a tense scene with a lot of dim lighting, and you go to some theater and the thing is blasting too bright. Just have a very bright projector in too small a room, or you go into a different theater and it's so dim you practically can't see everything and it becomes a whole different scene. So absolute brightness allows you to say, no, this scene should be exactly this brightness, as close as the device can get. In movie theaters, they try to solve this by essentially having standards for how bright the image should be at the seating position. But there's a lot of loosey-goosiness there. There's a lot of houses that have been grandfathered in. There's houses where they worked it all out and then they changed something and nobody bothered to recalibrate. So really, this is a paradigm shift that allows you to get a better view of what the intent was of the filmmaker, potentially. Certainly at the low end, you're more likely to get what the filmmaker intended. It's where you get into really bright scenes and how exactly you're supposed to map a really bright scene onto a device that can't go that bright. That's where things get really interesting.
Do you think that this is where the confusion comes with HDR? Because as soon as you mention HDR to anybody, certainly that we speak to within the forums and so on, they immediately want to know what the peak brightness is of a display and so on, and they're thinking about brightness as in the intense brightness of specular highlights and so on. But what people are perhaps not realising is that actually in the shadows and in the midtones, you are more likely to see what's going on compared to, like you say, if it was graded at 100 nits, compared to it being graded at 1,000 or 2,000 or 4,000, whatever. There is that consistency there now, that from display to display, as long as the display is doing something right, you're actually seeing more within the just above blacks and midtones and so on. It's not just about how bright an image is.
Right. Well, you certainly have more granularity and control. And in fact, I think the majority of picture information is below 100 nits.
Yeah.
So, that's where the meat of the material is at. And then the specular highlights are used, and even colors, I guess. So the brighter the display can go, the more you'll actually see that color before it turns white or desaturates. So to Don's point, though, I want to bring up a couple things. So we went to, I'll use Dolby Cinema as an example. So Dolby comes in, they install their HDR system in a cinema, and then they leave, and the theater comes in and makes changes to the environment. So, for example, Don and I saw Justice League in Northern California at a Dolby Cinema, and they had this blue accent lighting that was on the whole time. And so when the screen would go black, you would see the blue light illuminating the screen, which made it very unpleasant. And we had a similar issue here where the lower left and right corners would have red highlighting on the screen. And so I think a few of us, we actually took in Duvetine and tape, and we masked that off when we went to see the movie, and they eventually fixed it after 3 or 4 times of us doing that. The other is, so, Don talked about, is there headroom for HDR? So with HLG, because HLG is a relative system, there's BBC and there's NHK. So from BBC's standpoint, they want to use the headroom to actually get brighter than 1,000 nits, whereas NHK does not want to do that. And so now you have differences even on how to implement HLG because of that.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, that was a long rant. I think that's the biggest thing, is that relative does not really, as it turns out, give you closer to original intent. And absolute, it basically does. I mean, if it's implemented correctly, you really do get something very, very, very close to what the mastering people saw, or what the filmmaker intended. And certainly the important thing is you can find out what was intended from the disc. I mean, the disc has on it, this is what it should look like. If your display can't do that, okay, but the idea is to get the display to do as close as it can to the original intent.
Well, I think one of the pushbacks initially from the absolute system was they didn't really understand the new transfer function in bit depth. So what I mean by that is, so with DVD or in Blu-ray, we have 8-bit. And so we're used to thinking, okay, 8-bit, we want to use all the code values because we don't have very many. So then with HDR and this absolute system, we're now saying, well, we're not even going to use all the code values. And so now people are starting to get concerned there's going to be more banding because you're using fewer code values. The problem is because this new transfer function is just much more efficient, much more maps what our eye does. So with gamma, you didn't have enough code values near black and you had too many near white. So it just wasn't an even distribution of code values. But with PQ or ST2084, you have a much nicer distribution. So, and I think that the example given by Dolby is PQ requires about 2 bits less than gamma does. So if you had a 15-bit in gamma, you can get away with 13 bits in PQ. Although the way PQ was designed, it was for like 11 point something bits, and they just round up to 12. So it's all about coding efficiency. And so I think a lot of people approached that and said, oh, well, I've only got 10 bits and I'm not even using all the code values. Clearly, I'm going to see banding or other artifacts. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes sense.
Now, I will say that today we have issues.
Keep in mind that even with 10-bit, you have more code values now between, say, 0 and 100 nits. So even if you're encoding STR stuff, and you've decided to just encode it into a 0 to 200 or 0 and 100 kind of range, you have more code values in 10-bit than you did with 8-bit, full SDR. So people complaining about the number of code values, I guess they're thinking wrong mathematically. It's wrong.
Sure, but they're thinking
it's a technical jargon term we use in the industry. Wrong. Yeah.
Right, but instead of going 100 nits 0 to 64 to 940, now it's 64 to 509 is your first 100 nits.
Right.
So it is a different distribution. But one of the issues we're having today where you are seeing banding in HDR displays is not because of that curve, it's because the panels are still native gamma. So for example, if you take an LCD or an OLED, you still have to send a 2.2 gamma to that panel because that's what it's going to expect inside the panel itself, not what you're sending to the actual display.
Can I ask a question from the point of view of people using this new disc? So the first menu option is configuration. It defaults to 1000 nits and P3D65 within BT 2020. Given some content mastered at 1000 nits, some is at 4000 nits, and some is even at 10,000 nits now, would you recommend, if someone wanted to evaluate their new TV, would you recommend using the default 1000 or going for 10,000, or just trying all of them and seeing what happens?
So that's a great question. And so I think our approach was, so we set the default settings that we think would work most of the time, but the idea is that you would choose the nit value closest to the capability of your display for calibration. And then as a reviewer, you would use the other nit levels for evaluation to see how the display handles it. But it turns out, because of Sony in particular, they clip highlights in certain situations. So there are actually people who are creating one memory for 4,000 nit content and another memory for 1,000 nit content, and basically having contrast at a different setting for both of those. Which now if we're going to have to set up memories for, based on your content, that's going to become very difficult.
Yeah,
well, it means the person has to, first of all, know what it was encoded at, which isn't always obvious, unless you have a player that tells you that. It makes sense. What's the purpose? I mean, obviously the disc is designed to be future-proof to a degree, so hence things like 10,000 nit. And is that why there's BT 2020 as an option, even though nothing's actually created using that color space at the moment?
Oh, we created ours using that color.
Yeah, so. I know, but I meant commercially available, movies and that sort of stuff.
Well, I mean, yeah, it is the so one of the things that we should point out is our disc has to serve multiple markets. So in a perfect world, we would make a disc just for consumers. We'd have a disc for reviewers. We'd have a disc for manufacturers. But that's cost prohibitive for us to make, unless somebody wants to pay, manufacturer wants to pay $10,000 for a disc. We kind of put everything that covers all those markets onto a single disc, which is why we have all those options.
And the other thing, one of the things I love about your disc from the very first disc was the demo material, because particularly that first disc was great because you plopped it on. If I was doing calibration for somebody, I'd stick that disc on straight afterwards, go through the demo material. That would start first. Looks amazing, and then you can go into the test patterns, and there were some very straightforward test patterns you could quickly go through to show things like whether it was clipping and that sort of stuff. The demo material on the new disc, on the 4K disc, is absolutely stunning.
It is.
Can you just quickly talk about how you shot it, why you did it the way you did it, and what you did to create that demo footage?
Sure. And then I'll tell you after that, all the things that are currently wrong with it are the things we ran into while making it and how we're going to fix that in the future.
No, cut him off. Cut his mic.
So I had 3 goals with the montage. 1, I wanted to go to 10,000 nits because that's the standard. That's the theoretical standard. I wanted to use the full 2020 color volume. And 3, I wanted to shoot and master and finish in 8K. So I wanted to do all those things. And so everything was shot on either VistaVision Dragon from Red or VistaVision Monstro. So Dragon VistaVision was the first 8K sensor, and that was used on like Guardians of the Galaxy 2. There were just very few of them, and I just happened to be one of the lucky ones that got one. And so I think there's 70 shots in total. 16 of them were on Monstro, which is the newer sensor, and then the rest were on Dragon. And that was shot mostly in the Southwest, so from Colorado to Washington through Oregon. And so that was shot by 3 of us. So I shot a few shots in there. Clark Dunbar, who does a lot of stock footage, I made an arrangement with him where I said, since at the time I think I had rented the camera to IMAX and it was renting for about $3,000 a day. That's how exclusive they were. And so I made him a deal. I said, I will let you use the camera, and I let him have it for like 6 months, as long as I get rights to use everything he shot. And he's a fantastic cinematographer. I think he shoots wonderful nature footage. And then there's also one shot in there by a guy named Phil Holland, and that's the Seattle skyline shot. He was also one of so I think he was number 1 or number 2 who got the VistaVision Dragon first, and I was like number 3 or 4. So there were like 6 of us that had this camera around the world, outside of the Guardian, or outside of Marvel, basically. And so shot everything at 8K, and then I think I edited it offline in Adobe Premiere, and then I went back and rendered all the shots out at full resolution as 16-bit EXRs, and then I shipped those to Dolby. Dolby actually graded it using Resolve on the Dolby Pulsar display, which is their 4,000 nit monitor. But it's a 4,000 nit 1080p monitor. And that actually led to some interesting problems in that, so if you have little hot pixels at 8K, when you're viewing on a 1080p display, which is the Pulsar, you don't see those hot pixels. So I think the first time we encoded the disc, there were a bunch of hot pixels we missed. And I went through and I hand removed all those hot pixels. And I think after doing the Dolby Vision version, some more hot pixels just magically showed up. They were there. They were just more obvious in Dolby Vision that are still on the disc. But we had, like I said, we had a number of difficulties. For example, when we rendered out, so Resolve SDI output to the Pulsar, everything was remapped correctly in terms of the wide gamut. And then when we rendered, it wasn't correctly remapped. So colors that went beyond 2020 gamut were simply hard clipped. And so the first iteration, we had some nasty noise in reds. And so then we used a product called Transcoder from Colorfront that then sort of fixed that problem. So it didn't fix we didn't go back and fix the original problem. We just corrected it afterwards. And that's one of those things that I want, that and hot pixels are something I want to redo and fix next time around when we regrade it for Dolby Vision 4.0.
Okay, so you're saying there was mistakes in it. I haven't seen any mistakes. Did you, Steve?
No, it looks amazing to me.
Well, when you've started all the frames individually, you know where things are at.
Yeah.
So at some point you have to make the decision to ship, and so. Yeah.
Sorry, on Dolby Vision, just to clarify for the listeners, on the disc, there's 2 options, FEL and MEL. Do you want to quickly explain what you mean by that?
Sure. So FEL stands for full enhancement layer, and MEL stands for minimal enhancement layer. So when the original Dolby Vision title shipped, the only thing they supported at the time was MEL. And what MEL is it's the base layer, which is HDR10, so it's 10-bit, plus dynamic metadata. So the statistics that it captured beforehand and any trim passes that you and the colors might have done during the grading process to be used later. So that's what MEL is. Now, FEL, or the full, it actually uses the full 12-bit data. So you have the enhancement layer is not just metadata, it's actually residual picture information. So what happens is you first encode the base layer, and then you decode the base layer, and then you run this tool on it that will then take the difference between the original 16-bit source TIFFs and the 10-bit encode, including compression artifacts, and it stores that delta in the enhancement layer. So in theory, you could have a low bitrate encode with blocking artifacts that the enhancement layer could fix. Haven't tested that theory, but that's the theory. But basically, the full enhancement layer gives you the full 12 bits of content.
Right. Thank you.
So originally, we were just planning the full enhancement layer. We ran into some issues during encoding, and the person did the encoding, the company's Pixelogic. They had created a minimal enhancement layer as a test to see if it was the full causing the problem, and it wasn't. So because I had the second one, I thought it would be fun to include it as well.
Right.
And I understand you also used David Mackenzie, who used to be a TV reviewer for us at AVForums a long time ago. But he's really made a name for himself. Motion Infidelity's company's called, I think. Is that right?
Yes, Fidelity in Motion.
Fidelity in Motion. I knew it was one way or the other. So you used him as well for the disc.
Yes. So obviously GDMX is no longer around because they were purchased by Deluxe, and so they're just gone. And so we were looking for someone new to author, and David had actually reached out to me when we did the second disc. So he'd asked, hey, I noticed you used X264. Are you allowed to do that? And this is before he was into authoring. And I explained to him, yeah, you could, because basically, there are companies that won't use X264 because of, at least at the time, because of MPEG-LA, but that has nothing to do with the content on the disc. That's just the tools themselves. So, and he'd started shortly after that, and I forget how we actually got in touch, but I'd reached out to him at some point and asked him, and he was fantastic to work with. And he was very patient as we kept making changes. In fact, there were some other changes I think I wanted to make, but I felt so bad I didn't ask. I figured we'd fix them later in the future, but he was very good at making changes, and he was quick turnaround. So with GDMX, so it took 8 months to author the second edition disc because GDMX was doing it as a side project. So for example, when they were working on The Hobbit, that pretty much pushed us to the side so they could do The Hobbit. Whereas with David, we didn't have that problem. So David, anytime we were constantly, I think we gave him the first, I saw you at CES, and then I think it was the end of the month, we started delivering assets to David. And so then I think within a couple of weeks, we had a working disc to work with. And it was just every time we found something, it was a quick turnaround, or we made changes and you just quickly turn it around.
Excellent. Good stuff. So I guess what we're getting from this is there's an awful lot of work has gone into producing this disc. You both have immense experience in this field, and it's fascinating sitting talking and listening to you explain things, and I'm sure our listeners are getting a lot out of it. I guess the main question a lot of them do have, and it was mentioned on the thread, is the benchmark, is it a calibration disc or is it an evaluation disc? What do you see it as?
Well, if you remember our interview at CES, I think I referred to it as an evaluation disc because with HDR, there's less you can do unless you have instrumentation. And you're fighting tone mapping. So a long time ago, TVs would come from the manufacturer, you'd buy them, and nothing would be set correctly. But nowadays, if you buy a new TV, a lot of the controls, for example, if you take an LG TV and you switch to cinema mode, brightness, contrast, those are all set correctly by default. And the only thing you're dealing with now is really panel variance in terms of SDR. So with an HDR disc, it feels like there's less you can do from a calibration standpoint, unless your display has, again, like LG, where you can calibrate a 1D LUT and a 3D LUT. So, all these displays, you still have CMS and you have grayscale, and you need test instruments for that. So that's really all you're really doing now with the disc, as opposed to, that's.
I think the value of the disc now is really in settings. Like, in a sense, you say, you can't calibrate the way we used to with a CRT. You'd have to set, all CRTs pretty much needed brightness, contrast, color, tint, and variety of sub settings calibrated, but they really didn't have a whole lot of other settings necessarily, although over time they added them. But now on TVs, I don't know, I have an LG TV and it has a gazillion settings, and it's glib to say, well, turn all of it off, just turn everything off, turn everything to low, minimum, off, whatever, is kind of the default advice. But one of the things that you can tell with a disc like this is, what is this setting doing? Like, what in fact should I set this to? And if you think about your player or your set-top box or whatever you have plugged in, it probably has various output modes. What are those doing? When you're staring at a device and it says, do you want regular black or enhanced black? Which one of those is correct? Do you want to guess? Well, if you have a disc, you can find out which one is correct. These are the things that are really valuable for any user. You don't need any equipment to just put up a variety of patterns, run through them, and then change a setting off and on these patterns and see what happens. This is one of the ways that we find things out. And it's sometimes very surprising. You turn on some enhancement you wouldn't think would have anything to do with anything and look at a pattern and see this artifact show up out of nowhere. These are really useful things. I think that...
I was going to say, to your point, so we talk about blindly turning everything off. Well, on your LG that you have, edge enhancement off actually means on, and on means off. So there's a case where you would turn it off and it would really be on, but you wouldn't know that unless you looked at a pattern that would actually show that.
I do think that there are valuable things to set. I think that on a variety of displays, contrast is not set what we would consider correctly, although that's a very dicey problem because of, in HDR anyway. Sharpness is a perceptual setting. There is no right or wrong per se, so that really does need to be set, and without an appropriate pattern, it's kind of hard to set sharpness. I mean, you can just put up normal picture content and turn it up until it starts to look funny and then turn it down, but it's nice to be able to put up a pattern that actually exercises a variety of different edge types, and you can see clearly when the edges are starting to get ringing and other, they'll start to look jaggy. You start to see, you're basically, as sharpening goes up, anti-aliasing gets worse and worse until you start to see the jaggies on edges. I guess the old calibration that we were all used to, that we all are familiar with, that everybody on this phone call is familiar with, of brightness, contrast, color, tint, most of that doesn't apply anymore. It shouldn't apply. And if it's not right on the TV, the chances you're going to be able to fix it by adjusting one of these settings is pretty small. I mean, color and tint is from, analog TV from the 70s,
Right, and where you had to deal with drifting, and so you would constantly adjust it because the TV would drift.
Yeah. You did an NTSC, not so much in PAL.
Right. Right. Yes, never twice the same color.
So actually, to Don's point, we talk, and so we have the whole article, choosing a color space, is trying to help you figure out what to set your player to. And so a customer that I've been interacting with on another forum, he was going back and forth. Should I use YCBR or should I use RGB? And so he tried something which I think we need to update our guide now. So both looked good to him. Something was slightly different. And so he ended up putting up the color bars pattern and going into the green only mode on his Samsung. And he found out in RGB that color decoding was wrong, which you can see in green only mode. But in YCBCR, color decoding was correct. So that was another level that he was able to use to determine, what he should send to his TV.
Yeah. It's an evaluation tool, and certainly as a reviewer, I find your disc absolutely. I couldn't live without it. Basically,
indispensable. Yeah.
Indispensable. And we've got the latest pattern generators and so on, but there's only so much you can do with a pattern generator. Sometimes just having a disc with the right patterns on there, or just a bit of demo material that we've maybe watched umpteen times.
You're really familiar with.
You're familiar with. I certainly find that as a reviewer, I find that a comfort to have something like your product.
If you want, though, we talked about sort of the work we put into designing these patterns. I think it might be worth talking about one pattern in particular and some of the differences on it.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you had time. So on the disc, under, I think, evaluation, advanced ramps or something. Anyways, there's ramps, stimulus ramps. And on the ramps, for red, green, and blue, you'll notice there's 3 styles of ramps. Actually, white has 1 style of ramp. Red, green, and blue have 3 different types of ramps. And then the secondary, cyan, magenta, yellow, have 2 styles of ramps. So on the red, green, and blue, it starts off with an S&M ramp at the top, then a round ramp in the middle, and a dither ramp at the bottom. And there's a reason we did that, and I think a lot of people, it's something we had worked on. So again, this is me going to Don, hey, can we build a better ramp? Because one of the problems with the ramp is you'll generate it in RGB, so the values will monotonically increase from 64 to 940. But then you have to store it as YCBCR on the disk, so that's a color conversion, and then the player will color convert it back. And when that happens, you get rounding errors, so not every value will come back to the right value. So you'll naturally have banding or steps in the ramp, and that's just inherent to color conversion and everything.
Just interject that those aren't rounding errors. It's just inherent to YCBCR to RGB conversion. Whenever you're doing integer RGB to YCBCR and back, even correctly rounded, even if you're doing the best math imaginable, you simply cannot represent all RGB colors accurately in YCBCR. YCBCR is a larger space mathematically, and so you are mapping a large number of RGB values onto a smaller number of YCBCR, and no matter what, you can't get back the original values. And specifically, you cannot represent a smooth gradation. You can't do monotonically increasing single color ramps, or can you? So Stacey can continue his story.
So the middle ramp that says round is that style of ramp, and then the one below it that says dither, we actually use dither during the conversion from RGB to YCBCR. That little bit of noise helps smooth out the ramp, so you should have fewer glitches in the ramp. But the top one then is our take on it. So Don had this idea that, okay, if we want to make certain values round trip, we have two other channels we can mess with. So if we're making a red ramp, that gives us green and blue, and we have the code values below black to adjust. So even though 64 is the bottom limit, we can still go below 64. So he wrote a tool that would basically did a brute force analysis to figure out which YCBCR triplets would produce the correct RGB triplet when converted back to RGB. And so by moving the other two channels up and down. And so that's a much smoother ramp, but it has an interesting side effect that if you clip before you convert to RGB, then you'll get this like an undulating pattern in the ramp itself. So now you can look at the ramp and quickly tell if you clipped before conversion or after. So if you clip after at 64, you're fine, everything is good. It's just if you clip in YCBCR first, then you get this nastiness, and it's a smoother ramp. So that was sort of one of the things that we had came up with. And we have a lot of our patterns have little hidden things in it like that we've worked on to try to make them better.
Yeah, and obviously this comes back to something that Steve raised in his review, and I know you guys are working on it, which is there's lots of very useful patterns on the disc that a lot of people don't know what they're supposed to be looking at. So I understand that you have this under control, and that there will be explanations as to what people should be looking for when they use different patterns.
Right, so we have Scott Wilkinson. He's working on two guides. First is the novice guide. So something that's self-contained, much smaller, to hopefully get people who are new to calibration up and running very fast. And then after that's done, we want to do a more in-depth guide. I don't know if you ever saw the disc Avia Pro that came with a binder, where every pattern literally had a scope view and full instructions on every pattern. So that would be our goal for the second doc, is to document the patterns like that.
Yeah, and I think that would be really useful.
That'd be really useful.
Really, really useful. Because I'm going to admit it, there are test patterns on your disc. I don't know what I'm looking for.
Well, and you can reach out anytime and ask us, and we'll also, in fact, if you reach out and ask specific questions, it helps us know where to target the instructions first.
Yeah, absolutely.
Never mind. I was going to give Stacy's email address. Everyone listening, just any pattern you don't understand. But then Stacy's just going to give my email address. And then...
But I've got to say though, and I want the listeners to realise this, that you are open to suggestion, because you asked me at CES, was there anything that would help? And I think I gave you two tests. Certainly the counting the number of zones on a FALD TV, a FALD counter. And that appeared on the disc. I don't know if I was the only person to ask for that, but certainly you are open to suggestions for patterns, aren't you?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm expecting you to write the documentation for that pattern.
That's easy. You just watch it and count. Okay, so like I say, there are plenty of things that we can talk about in the future. CES is coming up, so I'm sure that we will keep in touch for that, and anything that's being announced and whatever we'll cover on video. And then why don't we come back to this in the new year? That gives our listeners plenty of time to put questions to Stacey and Don. If you've got any questions, any ideas of patterns, anything that you would find useful, why not put them into the comments section of this podcast. We'll mark this one the Spears and Munsil podcast, so you know which one to look for on the forums. Just add your questions in there or add your suggestions, and I'm sure the guys will catch up with that when they've got time, and we'll come back to this and revisit it in the future. But for now, my thanks to Stacey and Don. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, so movie section of the podcast. Some of us went to the cinema. I went to see...
You need to guess which.
Yeah, well, I went to see Brad Pitt's face. I now know Brad Pitt really quite intimately. It's almost like you've been lying there just looking at his face for... God, too long. What did you think of Astra, Steve?
My friend leaned across to me and said they should have called it as ad nauseum. I tell you what, I enjoyed some of it quite a bit. And when I realised it was basically Apocalypse Now meets 2001, I was thinking, like, I could be up for this. This sounds good. Unfortunately, you didn't get Colonel Kurtz at the end of that journey. You got Tommy Lee Jones.
Yeah.
And not much. I mean, I get what they were going for. And I thought some of the visuals were absolutely spectacular.
Yeah.
But if you're going to start your film by saying we're going to make the most realistic version of space travel ever, you better actually deliver on that. And while some of it looks good, I don't think you can go through the rings of Neptune using a piece of old metal as a shield.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure there aren't any liquid oceans, liquid bodies of water on Mars because it's too cold. So I don't know why he was swimming through an underground lake.
Oh, go easy, guys. I haven't seen it.
But no, these aren't any major plot points. It's just. I think that they could have taken the concept and the idea of you need to get to a certain point in the outer reaches of the solar system for whatever reason and come up with a viable and interesting reason to get there with kind of
that's the
conclusion.
whole thing for me. The whole thing for me was the space side of it, the special effects, the cinematography, the sound design, the acting from Mr. Pitt.
It was awesome.
Couldn't fault any of that point. What the problem was that there wasn't much plot after that. There wasn't much plot at all, and I know what they were trying to do.
I nodded off a couple of times. I'll be honest.
I know what they were trying to do. It just didn't work.
I would have preferred it if they had genuinely taken Apocalypse Now and made it into a space film. So in other words, have it take place during a war and have a mission with him and a bunch of other people, which is how it starts. And then they have to get out to the far reaches of space for some reason to stop the war or save, I don't know, whatever the reason might be. It could have been a lot more fun. It was pretty joyless, wasn't it? It wasn't exactly a laugh a minute. It was all it felt like Terrence Malick made us. It's basically if Terrence Malick made a space
Star
film.
Wars.
Yeah, exactly. If Terrence Malick made Star Wars, that's what you would have got.
Can I ask a random question whilst I remember? Because I'm fascinated by the number of times he seems to be able to do this in his films. Does Brad Pitt randomly eat something on screen which is in no way, shape or form beneficial to the plot? He just eats on screen.
I'm trying to think now. I can't remember.
I'm sure
he does it an extraordinary number of times in his films. Goes all the way back. Yeah, but no, all the way back to Thelma and Louise. It's a really weird Brad Pitt thing, and I'd be fascinated to know if there's someone he does that.
Well, anyway,
I think
stunning. It's a bit boring.
Yeah, and the characters aren't really that nice. So again, what Steve said, quite joyless. So when I don't want to.
Again, I don't want to give anything away, but there's a sequence. If you imagine Apocalypse Now, when they stop to search the boat, then there's a firefight. They have their version of that. I wouldn't say exactly what it involves, but it's they stop for a mayday and something happens, which makes no sense to what you're thinking. Like, what's going on here? And then also, once again, and this is what really winds me up, when professional astronauts, act really stupidly. Not Brad Pitt. In fairness, Brad Pitt's character generally behaves quite intelligently and sensibly and calmly and acts like a professional throughout most of the film. But the rest of his crew, not so much. I mean, for example, I wouldn't open fire with a gun inside a spaceship. That ain't going to end well for anyone, is it? It's just stupid things, little things like that. Also, if you're going to, why would you build a 30-kilometer high antenna? This is the beginning of the film. It's in the trailers. Other than the fact that it looks cool when he falls off it, but surely it'll be easy just to build an antenna in space if you want to look for aliens.
Yeah, that's not space elevator height, is it? That's a bit weird, but
it's not meant to be a space. It wasn't a space elevator. It was a giant antenna that must have been at least 30 kilometers high, judging by how far he had to fall. But it was, it wasn't meant to be a space elevator. It was just a massive, massive antenna for looking for alien life, which seemed that I could think of easier ways of doing it than that.
Yeah.
Plus, also, anyway, it's at least it wasn't another Marvel movie, so maybe change. I'll tell you what, it was the best film I saw this week because Hustlers was excellent.
Right, well, we're coming on to that, so let's wrap up on Ad Astra. I'm going to give it 6 out of 10.
I'll give it a 7 for Brad and the effects.
Okay, Kaz, did you see it or not?
I've not seen it,
all right,
so
okay.
I disappeared.
It's pointless.
Wait for the disc of Archie.
I'm booked on Tuesday.
Oh yeah, all right. So, IMAX or.
Right, so
no.
I just went to a normal screen for Ad Astra. I wasn't paying a $5 extra for it.
I saw it in IMAX. It looked great.
I've got no IMAXs, but I got an X Plus, so I'm aiming for that.
Right, so that's what I went to see at the cinema. I didn't see anything else, but you saw a couple of things, Steve.
I did. I also I saw Hustlers. Basically on Thursday, I'd take the car and get serviced. So I thought, while they're doing that, I'll go and see a film. And it was an option of either going to see Hustlers or It Chapter 2. And since It Chapter 2 was 2 hours and 45 minutes long, whereas Hustlers was a nice tight 1 hour 50, I thought I'll go for Hustlers, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I think it's easily the best thing that Jennifer Lopez has done since Out of Sight. And I've got to say, whilst for the interest of accuracy, you wouldn't really see strippers 50 years old. Any high-end club wouldn't have anyone older than about 29. But she does look fantastic.
Steve's an expert at this.
She looks fantastic for her age, I've got to say, and her pole work was exemplary. So brought back some very fun memories for me. I enjoyed it. It's an entertaining film and worth checking out if you get a chance.
Okay. Was that it, or did you see anything else?
Oh, and on the same day I saw at Astra, I also saw Rambo: Last Blood, which I enjoyed. It's not as I didn't enjoy it as much as I enjoyed Rambo, the one before. But it does a similar thing in that it builds up. It creates a situation. I don't want to give too much away, really. It creates a situation, and then forces Rambo in a situation where he has to
kill a bunch of people,
kill a lot of people very violently. Unfortunately, a lot of the killing takes place in the dark, so it wasn't quite as much fun as Rambo, where he's letting loose with a 50 cal and blowing people to pieces in broad daylight. Which I watched. My friend and I watched Rambo, and then went to see Rambo: Last Blood, and it was a good double bill. But I definitely enjoyed Rambo the most. It's just the last 20 minutes of that film is just cathartic and visceral in equal measure. This has got some very gory. It's got a good hard R. Did you see it, Kaz?
I did see it. Yes, yeah. I reviewed it. Yeah.
I enjoyed it, and if it is the last Rambo film, I think it's reasonable.
He's 73 for God's sake.
I think it's probably going to have to be at his age.
I don't know. They're still circling it and talking about it, but I mean, I think it's a fitting conclusion to the saga. I thought it was probably the weakest for me because out of the 5, they all have different pros and cons. Like the first one's a proper classic, and the 2 in the middle are just downright cheesy action.
The Rambo 3, in terms of showing the nature of changing alliances depending on the geopolitical system at any one time, that's quite a
dedicated to the brave fighters of the Mujahideen, Al Qaeda.
But I mean, you don't watch it for that, and for what it is, 2 and 3 are enjoyable in different ways. I too revisited the last Rambo, 2008's Rambo, and I found that was considerably better on a budget, and actually probably benefited from having him direct the thing. This one felt it was a bit rough around the edges. Some of the car scenes were particularly dodgy, like not green screened, the
rear projection.
Fake, it's really not what I expected from any movie these days. Very, very bad rear projection on anything involving sitting in a car driving, which there was strangely a lot of. But the setup was nice, and
I don't even think it was rear projection. I think it was just a black background with people pointing lights at the car and moving them around. I think it was poor man's process shots. I mean, I thought the plot. Well, it turned into Home Alone for one thing.
It was kind of.
It's a hard R Home Alone. That's what it ended up being.
Taken Home Alone. Yeah, it was. But yeah, it was Rambo doing his thing.
I would have. To be perfectly honest, I wish I hadn't made it, because I actually think the previous film Rambo has the perfect ending, where he returns home at the end after all those years, and I felt that was it. There wasn't a need for another Rambo movie. So yeah, I mean, it was okay. I enjoyed it. It was an hour and a half. It went in a blink of an eye. But unlike Ad Astra,
he maybe had a couple of big tax bills that he had to settle.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know. He's been waiting 10 years to make a decent Rambo, and it feels like he's waited for a suitable story. Because I don't mind the idea.
I felt like the story, it's prescient. I tell you what amazes me with Rambo, the previous film, the whole thing about Burma, and the genocide going on there, which is obviously, we've now discovered since is even worse than we thought in terms of the Rohingya. That was quite prescient, and this one obviously addresses a similar issue, which is the North in relation between America and Mexico. But it felt a bit like it was kind of peddling the same rubbish that Trump does, where Mexicans are basically rapists and murderers. And I'm not saying I want to spend time in some of the rough parts of Juarez or something like that, but it did feel a bit jingoistic.
Oh,
Well, no, it was never jingoistic. Not in the way that say Rambo 2 and 3 are, but it just felt like simplistic. And too, whereas there was a degree of sophistication to Rambo in terms of its addressing what was genuinely a civil war that was appalling. This felt simplistic, and the story, it deserved a better. If it was going to be the last one or send off him, it could have done with a better story. It felt a bit.
Still, he's pretty good for 73. I mean, it's impressive work. What I thought was the nicest bit for me was the closing montage, and I'm surprised by how many people didn't sit to the end, because actually at the end of the entire montage there's a few shots of the end of the film, as it were, like it's beyond the end of what we saw at the end of the film.
It's all set for the last one where he declares vengeance on the nursing home in which he's been placed.
But anyway, I really liked the montage at the end. I thought it was a very nice way to reflect on the progress over the movies, and it was quite nice that it was bookended the way it was. What I found interesting to hear about was that in the UK and the US we got a different cut, and there's actually a cut in other countries like Australia where there's an entire 15-minute prologue scene where Rambo, in the pouring rain, has to rescue some people who are trapped in a flood, and I have no idea why we didn't get that. And it's I've seen the shots from it.
Seems unnecessary given what happened in the film.
Well, I mean, it was just a setup to show that what he was, I guess, up to, and maybe start the movie with action rather than instead the movie we got starts with him riding a horse round a pen training it. But in this, it started it with him in the middle of a precarious situation, faced with death again. And I'm just intrigued by the fact that some countries got it, and it wasn't even just the UK. The US didn't get it either. So it's an entire setup, entire scene, which they just ripped off the beginning of the film and just had him started on a farm.
How bizarre!
Yeah,
I knew this was going to happen. We don't need to do much because we pre-recorded the middle bit. Yeah, we've managed to do 35 minutes.
Oh, don't worry, because the film's coming out this week. I'm going to get a lot of coverage.
73-year-old Stallone deserves credit for doing.
Yes. No, the violence is top drawer. So if you like seeing men's heads exploding as they get blown off by a shotgun,
spot of violence.
Yes, really top drawer violence is there. So which I thoroughly enjoyed. So.
Right. Okay. So let's move on. Films opening this week. Cars.
Yeah, we got Nicole Kidman in The Goldfinch. The
way you said that means you have no idea what that's about.
I've heard about it. I have heard about it. It's Kidman's latest film. That's why I started.
Can I be clear about this? I have no desire to go and see this, and I have never read the book on which it's based. I have not seen for a while the level of variation in reviews of this, and the visceral hatred it has generated in a couple of reviews has been quite surprising, because it didn't strike me as that contentious a thing. But no, a couple of US reviews have absolutely bloody loathed it. I mean, I'm not for a second going to actually waste 2 hours and 29 minutes of my life working out whether they have a point or not, but it's interesting that a film I haven't seen a film generating that level of visceral response in a while.
Although Rambo did. The feedback on Rambo has been absolutely horrendous. People are just crying out about how it's racist, prejudiced, it's backwards.
You mean the points I just made?
Yeah, but really hammering it home, because I think the points you made about it being a weaker storyline.
How did we get back to Rambo? We're talking about films coming out this week.
But yes. Anyway,
well, sorry, I know I have maybe haven't given the Rambo reviews as much, but I just as a random bookend to this Goldfinch film, it has generated some peculiar press, which may or may not intrigue people with an unlimited ticket and a burning desire to spend 2.5 hours sat in a darkened room.
Yeah, no, wait for the Blu-ray. So Hotel Mumbai is also coming out, which has been on the radar for a bit. I've got a feeling it's a Sky original, so I'm wondering whether it's going to be added to my list for Friday. But that's Dev Patel, terrorist attack in Mumbai. Yeah, and Army Hammer, yes. And Ready or Not, which I've seen the trailer for like 30 times.
Yeah,
I think for the first maybe 15 or so, I was like, I really want to see this film. And for the last 15, I wanted to walk out of the trailer because enough is enough. Spitting image of
Margot Robbie. I kept thinking, is that Margot Robbie?
Image
no, don't think
of Margot Robbie. The whole time I was thinking this is Margot Robbie, but not quite. Anyway, looks interesting. Had some interesting reviews on advanced screenings, which weren't quite what I expected. But we'll be covering that.
Positive.
No. So
I can't say I thought it looked cobblers, but
I thought it looked quite enjoyable. Like it didn't look like it was going to win an Oscar.
I don't want to see a film about hide and seek where they're trying to kill you. It just sounds silly.
Really? We just watched Rambo.
That's different. I will sit there for 2 hours and watch Rambo viciously kill people and love every second of it. Believe me. But
if it's not him and it's someone who's not quite Margot Robbie, who's going
Margot Robbie light.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, anyway, we'll see how that turns out.
Is she related to Margot Robbie? Because she's spitting image.
Let's do the disc.
On discs this week, we have 4K releases. Got DC Animated, which is 5 of their animated titles, all released in one reasonably priced package. I think it's about 50 quid, so a £10 title. Debatable whether or not you're going to upgrade for the animations, but if you don't already own them, it's an interesting way to start your collection. Got both Aladdins, so the classic animation and the new live-action adaptation, which I just started watching and I'm actually surprisingly enjoying. And we've also got Lock Up, it's more Stallone, a really odd choice for 4K. And Rocket Man is on the list, but it's actually been delayed. So
I got my copy from the States. It's really good.
Yeah, you have everything early, man. But yes, that's actually been delayed. So that's not this week. And
when it doesn't turn up, it's worth getting.
Yeah, well, the review's up, so plus that. But the actual retail release isn't for a bit. Blu-ray, we've got the Coca trilogy, which is up by Criterion. That's part of the competition for this month's releases. We've got Hellraiser 2 Hellbound and a couple of the DC series releases, Flash Season 5 and Supergirl Season 4. There are reviews for those up as well. And on streaming this week, we've got In the Shadow of the Moon, which looks interesting. The only thing that's got me wary is the fact that it's got a teen label on Netflix. I don't know what that means. But
is it a series or a film?
It's a film, thank the Lord, so I don't have to watch 24 hours of telly to just review it. But it's a serial killer film, an age-old murder when he was a
I saw the trailer.
It looks interesting. It's the guy who directed Cold in July, so that's given it the edge for me. So we'll see whether he gets sucked into standard Netflix fare or pulls out something of a gem. And there's also this Sturgill Simpson presents.
I am so looking forward to this.
So I have no idea about any of this, but after the popularity of Love, Death and Robots, I thought I ought to give this a look. It looks like Mad Max with country rock soundtrack.
Sorry, I don't want to prolong the agony on this one, but that's a slightly unfair definition of what Sturgill Simpson does. Some of his work is just unbelievably good. His album, A Sailor's Guide to Earth.
Who is it? Who is he?
He's an American musician.
Oh, yeah.
But his album
what's his flavour of music?
There is indisputably elements of country to it, but it's cleverer than that. It doesn't just talk about pickup trucks, incest, and guns. He does things that
those are the bits I like.
If you wanted to set up his album, A Sailor's Guide to Earth, it's one of the occasions where an artist with whom I've not been terribly familiar, I listened to the album again, and I immediately bought a copy on vinyl. It's just extraordinary. And his cover of Nirvana's In Bloom it's hairs on the back of the neck stuff. I'm looking forward to this because I think
this guy was one of your albums of the month, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. No question. It was.
Right. That's another one you can review.
We need to discuss given that I'm not a full-time employee of AVForums, we need to discuss how on earth this breaks down. But yes, all right, I can certainly add my feedback to it. When's it out?
I'm thinking Friday. I'm going with that. I'm only joking. You can just talk what you've just said into one of those voice dictators and then email them. It's fine. It's like, it's not what you think it is, but yeah, it's kind of country. And yeah, do it.
Country is a broad church, sometimes literally. But Sturgill Simpson is a truly extraordinary musician, and if they've done Mad Max with a weird Sturgill Simpson soundtrack, I'm in for that in a big way.
It does. It does look. I mean, it's an anime, but it does look interesting. So let's see what Friday brings.
Excellent.
There you go. I raced through those, Phil. Boom.
Right. Okay. So that's the discs, the Blu-rays, the streaming services, and Rambo. I'm sick of hearing about Rambo. Considering I've never seen a Rambo film, I have no idea what.
What?
You should watch First Blood. First Blood is a genuinely good film.
Unbelievably brilliant.
Yeah, First Blood is God.
And it's worth watching Rambo just for the level of violence at the end, which is off the scale.
I'm really surprised. You should have watched those while testing out the TVs.
Yeah, but it would appear that we all have a clutch of films where our admission that we've never watched it brings other people up in hives.
Because Ed's never seen Jaws. I have
now seen Jaws. Yeah. I have now seen Jaws, but it did take me until last year to watch Jaws.
So you finally seen. So what did you think?
No, it's really good, really good. Not quite ready to let Will watch it. I mean, Will's fascinated by things in the sea at the moment, but I don't think we're ready to quite make the leap from.
How old is Will?
5. We're not quite ready to make the leap.
Put him off that. Yeah.
Leap from.
My sister was 6 when we went to see it at the cinema, and I think she was probably a bit young for that.
The probably is doing quite a lot of heavy lifting in that sense.
I think I was 8 and I was a bit young for it, frankly.
Yes. So, but no, and then, just to wind up, there is of course the fact that I absolutely loathe The Shawshank Redemption. It's like I've seen it. It's just bored the arse off me.
I don't loathe it, but at the same time, I don't understand the love for it either.
I suppose that's a fair.
It's a nice film, but I don't understand the love for it. Sorry.
And you hate Moulin Rouge as well, don't you?
God, no! Don't get me started. We'll be here all night.
Oh, I love Moulin Rouge.
I would sooner eat my own scrotum than watch that film again.
There's my byline, and that's us finished for this evening on that bombshell. My thanks to Ed Selley.
Oh, just go away and leave me alone.
Steve Withers.
Her name is Incontinentia Buttocks.
And Kaz Harlow.
There's no pleasing some people.
Don't forget, you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook, bookmark AVForums.com for latest reviews, news and videos. Plus, why not leave us a 5-star rating on iTunes, but only if you enjoyed the show. Also, head over and check out our YouTube channel for videos on the latest product releases and reviews. And while you're there, feel free to subscribe. I'm Phil Hinton, thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you again next week.